Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn. It is wonderful weather, the pollen are out, the mosquitoes are biting. We have sunshine in North Germany and ready for a big May 1st celebration. And I'm doing a wonderful day today. I'm doing 2 recordings in one day, which will be fun to do. And my first guest today, I'm actually really looking forward to this conversation, even though it's the wrong Napoleon from my perspective. But it's still a Napoleon, so that's good. We'll have great fun with this. So my guest comes from Maryland, Mark Ehlers. He is currently a teacher at Sandy Spring Friends School. And he has previously taught at private schools. He has also been at the US Military Academy in West Point, served in the US military for a few years, including Iraq as an officer. Unfortunately, I have to say, he has a PhD from that Alice Who place in Louisiana. We'll not count that too much against him, since he is in the good part of the country now. And the book we're going to talk about today is Napoleon in America, Bonaparte and the Rhetoric of US Empire, which came out with the University of Virginia Press. So, Mark, first, thanks so much. It's really early for you, and you're already at work, committed to your student success, even though today you're talking about your book.
So, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
You're welcome. And so, tell me how a person who served in the US military, who teaches high school, becomes interested in the way Americans perceive, remember, and think about Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So this book grew out of sort of a chance interaction I had with another text. Back in graduate school, I was researching something else. I came across a strange story from I think it was 1819 about a debate between two state representatives in New York, one of whom was the future president Martin Van Buren. And they were arguing over the naming of a tiny little hamlet, still there, named Austerlitz and Waterloo. And they almost came to blows over this. You know, was this going to be named after Napoleon's greatest victory, or was this going to be named after Napoleon's greatest defeat? And it just struck me as that this is very strange that that this seems so important to them. And so that sort of stuck with me. And but as I continued doing research in the early 19th century United States, I started realizing, oh my gosh, Napoleon's everywhere. He's this cultural rhetorical symbol that Americans are appealing to, and so clearly he meant something to Americans. Later, I found out he meant many things to Americans. And so that set me on the path of figuring out, okay, what are those things? What did Napoleon mean to Americans? Why do they talk about him in the ways that they do, and how does that change over time? And so that's sort of how this got started.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and important to note that you're not talking about Napoleon or like how he's like a figure of diplomatic interest. You're talking about how he's being used for different purposes for different people over like 50 years in the United States, which is like it's such an interesting and different way of thinking about this.
Yeah. I one of my passions is Civil War memory, and how do Americans remember the Civil War. And actually, at LSU, I started working with Charles Royster. I was hoping to do something with Civil War memory, and he retired, and so I moved to working with Nancy Eisenberg, who's an absolutely wonderful advisor. And she said, nope, no Civil War. So I was like, okay, well, I guess I got to find something else. But yeah, but this memory, thinking about the historical memory is not like a recent thing. It's not that, it's not, it doesn't just start with the lost cause or that sort of thing. Americans have been, shaping their understanding of themselves as a people since the very start, by finding these symbols, finding these um, signifiers that they can use to ask themselves who are we and why do we do what we do. So that I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and it's sort of like a question that I was thinking about. Do you think of your book more as a book about memory, or do you think of your book more as sort of a intellectual history? I guess, would be the other way to think of it.
Yeah, I think it's I think one of the reasons I like the book is it does cross so many sort of genres like that. Yeah, I think it does, I think, have a lot to say about historical memory. It has a lot to say about the idea of the frontier in U.S. history. It has a lot to say about American national identity and nationhood and national construction. And Napoleon is like the point where people gravitate to. He's sort of like the black hole of American history. Everything, people, of all. This is the really interesting thing, is that Napoleon was so well known by Americans through a variety of ways, that, if you wanted to make a point in the early 19th century in the United States, you told a story about Napoleon, everybody, and with the, thinking that everybody would understand that. And one of the things I found in my book is that, at least at first, there is sort of a common understanding of who Napoleon is. And even though Americans have very different understandings of, okay, well, if this, if this is who he is, he's a threat to American expansion. Okay, so what do we do about it? They had different ideas about that. But after Napoleon's death in the early 1820s, suddenly that single understanding of who Napoleon is sort of shatters. And suddenly, people are trying to make a point about Napoleon, and people are coming away from these stories with very, very different understandings of who Napoleon is. I found some of these, in the newspapers during the Mexican-American War, where they would be arguing for or against the American incursion into Mexico. And so one person in one newspaper would tell one story and say, well, obviously this this is what the story means. We obviously need to invade Mexico. And somebody the next day would write back in a rival newspaper saying, okay, this guy's full of it. He doesn't understand the real meaning of this story of Napoleon, which is something very different. We shouldn't invade Mexico. So it was really fascinating, and it does cross so many different genres that and that's why I think I had so much fun writing it. Is it could touch on so many different topics.
Was there a specific reason why you kind of ending around the Mexican War? Is it like, was there a reason why you kind of felt like by the 1850s the image is done, or did it just disappear and people were just not that interested anymore?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So the short answer is the American Civil War happened. And
I was going to
and
ask a
so
follow-up on that.
yeah. So it's kind of interesting. You see, like right at 1860, if we must call it this, Bonapartism is really at its high point in the United States. I found, they literally have little books of poetry and songbooks you could buy in American bookshops. Peons to Napoleon. And going into the Civil War, Americans, really, both North and South, thought of, tried to define their experience in terms of what they had learned from these biographies, primarily of Napoleon, that had been coming out of Europe. There's a few homegrown ones, but most of them were coming out of Europe. Walter Scott's was notorious, but there were Barry O'Mara and some others that were famous. But they were really sort of trying to define their experience as as combatants in this war by what this highly romanticized version of who Napoleon was and what war was like. And then, as they encountered war, real war, they realized that they had gotten perhaps a bit of a rosy picture of what war was really like. Gerald Linderman and it's a book about embattled courage. One of my favorites about the Civil War. Sort of addresses this. This breaking down of this romantic sense of courage during the war. But you see the same thing with American ideas about Napoleon. They start out by trying to define their, they called, McClellan the young Napoleon, and PTG Beauregard, Napoleon, and all these promising young officers were going to be the next Napoleon, and none of them end up being the next Napoleon. And I think that's one strike that causes this, but also, the generals, the officers that do manage to win the war, Sherman, Grant, these types of people, they are very unlike Napoleon, at least the Napoleon that Americans had come to know and love, so to speak, in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. And so by the end of the war, not only have Americans, had sort of their illusions about warfare shattered, their illusions about Napoleon have sort of been shattered, and frankly, they have a new pantheon of heroes. They feel like they don't have to measure themselves up against Napoleon anymore because, well, we've got Sherman and we've got Grant and we've got these other Sheridan. We've got these other heroes now that we don't need to worry. We don't need to compare ourselves to Napoleon anymore. We've sort of outgrown that. That doesn't go away. Americans still, sort of recall Napoleon at times. In Theodore Roosevelt's book, The Rough Riders, he has sort of a couple of throwaway references to Napoleon, and then there's an interesting book about Napoleonic memory by a French author in just after the First World War, in which he sort of looks down his nose at Americans who show up in Paris, and he said, "Oh, well, the first thing they all wanted to do was go see the tomb of Napoleon." And but he makes an interesting comment. He says, but at least this is only a minor case of Bonapartism, so clearly the Americans have sort of moved away from this sense of having to measure themselves by Napoleon. I actually end the book by mentioning one of the newspaper articles that I think was in the Times, New York Times, that I read while I was in Baghdad. It was actually published while I was there. Was an article by Richard Bollier, a very good historian, and basically he made the case that, well, Bush should think about getting out of Iraq before he gets sucked into this quagmire. And of course, the title of the article is Bush and Napoleon. So he's still there occasionally, but certainly does not have nearly the cultural relevance that he had in the early 19th century.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting in so many regards, right? That in part, it's probably military changes too. That Napoleon style of military doesn't work by the 1860s anymore, and especially by the First World War, it doesn't work at all anymore. But it's interesting to see too that a outsider holds that much importance as a political figure, as a symbolic figure in comparison to, we don't have a young Washington in the armies of the Civil War, right? No one is kind of taking Washington as sort of oh, this great military leader that brought the country to independence. It's interesting that it's Napoleon they all gravitate to.
No, they've even got I came across this when I was teaching at West Point. I found the records. They actually had an officially sanctioned Napoleon Club in the 1850s, and they actually got permission. I believe it was even while Robert E. Lee was superintendent for a couple of years. They got permission to basically take over one of the rooms in West Point. They had gigantic maps of Napoleon battles up on the wall, and they'd come together, both cadets and present papers. George B. McClellan was one of the leading members, of course, they. But yeah, that don't see in we don't see a Washington Club. One of the things one of the books that I noticed is, these were very much aimed at children as well. One of the books that I came across was like, it was an illustrated, these illustrated children's guides, and they're trying to teach, what it means to be moral, what it means to be good. And it's a long, extended discussion comparing Napoleon and Washington. And the interesting thing is that this book, starts out by having, basically having to make a caveat that, well, even Washington, or even Napoleon, even the great Napoleon, admitted that Washington was his superior. And so the sense that so that what that tells me, reading between the lines, is you've got a lot of young Americans running around, wanting to emulate Napoleon and not necessarily Washington. And part of what this book is trying to do is tell you, well, that's not what we as Americans do. Our heroes should be, more restrained, more more moral, more and less ambitious. Yeah.
Well, but I do want to follow up with a question with regard to West Point, since you opened the door to that, actually, with the Napoleon Club and the room full of maps. I would assume that in the 1850s, as you kind of point out, was that Napoleon was very much taught and kind of revered in West Point.
Yeah.
Do you at all teach Napoleon anymore at West Point, or has he kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit as a...
Well, so that's a complicated question. The answer is yes and no. Napoleon is absolutely taught as a leader, as a great captain. He is taught in historical context, because he is very much an innovator in warfare. He is absolutely taught within the military history division and in the history department. Where he's not taught is in the military side of West Point. As you pointed out, many of the principles that were important to him are not particularly relevant today in warfare.
That walking in a line across an open field is not really that good anymore.
So I'm told. I hear. Yeah. Well, I hear the Russians are finding that out in Ukraine. But yeah. So he's not taught at like a tactical or even really a strategic sense. But he is taught as certainly an important figure, an important historical figure. And a figure with major historical significance.
Yeah, I also found it that totally makes sense, right? I mean, why would you teach Napoleon to future officers today in regard to tactics on the battlefield? But I thought it was really interesting when you said that the high point sort of this hype for Napoleon is in the 1850s, 1860. And like I said in my email to you, and my listeners know this very well, I like my Napoleon III, not the first. I do like that guy, but not as much. And it's interesting because I always think of like the 1850s when Napoleon III is in power in Europe. There's this visceral opposition, right? This autocrat there on the French throne, this anti-democrat. And I think it's sort of ironic then to think that in this very moment that Napoleon is on the throne in France, is eviscerated in the United States, you have the other Napoleon, which is, dare I say, beloved by people in the U.S.
Yeah. No, and the reason I think the reason that they can do that is because of all this printed material, these biographies, these anecdote books that come out after Napoleon's death, that Americans are reading, what's how Napoleon is portrayed in those books is partly as this sort of rags to riches story, as this poor Corsican boy who's becomes the emperor of France, and of course that really resonates with Americans, especially of the sort of middling class, in the midst of this market revolution that Americans are going through at the time. This sense of, okay, well, how do you pull yourself up by your bootstraps in this society? And Napoleon offers examples of that, and many times they focus on his character. In the sense of nose to the grindstone, full of energy, only sleeping a couple of hours a night, and his will to bust through any obstacle and cross the Alps, and so that okay, so that we can latch onto. That's admirable. That's useful to Americans on the make. The other thing that Americans latch onto that's portrayed in this printed material is that Napoleon is seen as sort of a liberal emperor, a liberal imperialist. That maybe despite some of his excesses, he brought the Code Napoleon to Europe and broke the monarchies of all these of Austria and Prussia and all these and Spain, and they sometimes forget he puts in new monarchs there, but yeah, he brings like civil liberty to Europe, or at least that's the way he's portrayed, and in many ways that translates well to Americans who are at this time really starting to embrace this idea of manifest destiny in their own sense of expansion west, and what kind of empire do we want to be? And many Americans, not all, but many Americans, look at Europe, look at Napoleon, and say, there's the example of what we want to be. We could be the liberal empire of the Western Hemisphere, and we could even do it better than Napoleon. And yeah, so I think it's those two things combined: this idea of his character and the market revolution, and then also this sense of his liberal imperial style that Americans really latch onto and say, yes, that's the person that we want to emulate.
It's still kind of like I still can't fully grasp that, like you're literally having a guy whose name is Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Right? The name is already telling you he's not a Democrat, he's not a liberal, but you latch on and you're like, I so desperately want him to be that symbol, so I'm gonna forget all the other.
He was elected. They had a referendum and everything. I think yeah, they're willing to look past that, and in some ways, sort of, so yeah, push that down, push down the obvious, and emphasize what they want to. It's very selective thinking about who Napoleon is, but I guess all historical memory is like that, and this is no different in the 1830s, 40s, 50s.
Yeah, and I think interesting too to kind of consider this moment in the 1830s where that comes, that rags to riches narrative, right? Like we're just ignoring all the parts that don't fit the Napoleon narrative, but we're just going to take the parts that really work. And I've seen the same being done with Columbus, and I think it was George Washington Irvine's biography of Columbus, where he literally kind of creates that same story for Columbus, and it's like it seems like a lot of people are getting that treatment by American authors in the 1830s, that they're becoming sort of part of the American pantheon.
The whole Horatio Alger idea, this idea, it really comes to usually we tend to think of it as sort of a product of the late 19th century, but it certainly begins early. I mean, go all the way back to Ben Franklin in his
Yeah.
autobiography. Look, here I am, a poor boy going into, ran away from Boston, my apprenticeship, and show up in Philadelphia with nothing, and look, here's how I did it. Here's how you can do it too. So this idea that anybody can be anything is really embedded in American in their consciousness.
Yeah. Oh no, it's great in that, and I think in many ways part of what you're also sort of really highlighting in that is sort of that the more distant Napoleon is in the past, the more you can manipulate his image to fit whatever narrative you really want to make with it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, if you look at the first part of the book, so this period between about 1800 or so and about 1815, 1820, there's general consensus among the American public that Napoleon is a bad actor, and an imperialist that is dangerous, not only to Europe but also, and most importantly, to the Americas. What is he going to do in the Americas, and how are we going to respond? There's a general consensus that he's bloodthirsty, he's ambitious. He has these insatiable appetites for expansion. And now, oh my gosh, he's right on our doorstep. And what do we do now? How do we respond to this aggressive imperialism? So when he was actually on the throne and actually a political actor and not a figment of people's historical imagination, there is a sense that there is a fairly common sense of who he is. The difference is, well, what do we do about it? But once he's dead, and once people start writing books about him, then he's this open vessel that can he can be whatever you want, if depending on which part of the story you want to highlight and what you want to ignore.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of like we're kind of taking your book backwards now, but that's totally fine. I love that kind of approach, anyways, and it's really interesting when you think of, like you already mentioned, right? Like Napoleon can become sort of that symbol of U.S. imperialism, westward expansion, and is used in that way in the conflict with Mexico. And it's in many ways ironic in ways too, because it's like the U.S. is sort of saying, "Oh, manifest destiny, we're bringing enlightenment, democracy to these unenlightened Mexican subjects in California, New Mexico," but then when it turns around, oh no, they don't get citizenship, right? They lose their ability to be political actors, and it's sort of like, in many ways, it's exactly what Napoleon does in places like Italy or in the German Confederation. So did anyone ever kind of sit back and be like, we're doing just as bad as Napoleon is?
Yeah, I think if you go back and look at the Louisiana Purchase, I think this is the best place to highlight this.
Sure.
Americans today continue to see the Louisiana Purchase as like this great triumphal moment of America expanding bloodlessly and democratically, bursting the bounds of the Treaty of Paris and and defeating Napoleon by diplomacy and not by military conflict. That is not how Americans saw it at the time, although it's very that is how they preferred to see it. At least some Americans shortly thereafter. But if you actually look at what happens, it's a considerably darker story. The Americans in 1802 are convinced that Napoleon, as soon as he subdues Haiti and Santo Domingo, he's going to turn north. He's going to send that army into Louisiana, and once he does, once he consolidates his rule in Louisiana, that's it. Americans aren't moving west anymore, because now you got an aggressive imperial state on your western border. When Spain was there, nobody really cared because the Spanish Empire was decaying. But now you've got Napoleon. Oh, that's a different story. And so what do? Well, quite a few Americans say, well, we better take it. We have to take it before he gets there. Preemptive. The doctrine of preemption. back in 1802. We have to launch a military strike on New Orleans to take that and defend it before Napoleon can actually get there. National security is at stake. When they actually it's only because Napoleon decides he for his own reasons decides he's going to sell Louisiana, and instead of trying to hold on to it because he's lost Haiti, that Americans sort of back off that, and they do gain it diplomatically. But then even when it comes time to actually occupy Louisiana, and it is an occupation, because no one's quite sure who these Louisianans are. They seem kind of weird. I mean, to the American sense of things. I mean, because they were French subjects, and then they were Spanish subjects, and now they're back to French subjects, and they're black and they're white, and there's indigenous people there, and there's an amalgamation of all this. Who are these people, and can they really be American subjects or American citizens? And if they can't be citizens, well, then they're going to have to be subjects. This debate over what do we do with Louisiana now that we've purchased it, and what do we do with the people there, opens a whole can of worms that Americans have to work out in terms of their imperial identity. There's a senator at the time who says we need to be careful here because Louisiana is going to set precedents. So Americans are very not quite sure what to make of the people of Louisiana and what to do with them. Many Americans do suggest some rather heavy-handed, let's say, imperial methods to ensure the loyalty of the people of Louisiana. In fact, oddly enough, Napoleon actually doesn't do a lot to dissuade Americans that their new that Louisianans are going to be loyal to them. He has published one of his last things. He has published in Louisiana basically a farewell note to the people of Louisiana, saying, oh, you will always be, close to our hearts, and our sons will be your sons, and remember who you are, and Americans read this and are like, what is going on here? I thought are we going to try incorporate these French subjects into the United States? And it's not until they're always worried, or at least a certain segment of Americans are always worried that the Louisianans are going to rise up, and they're going to rebel. They really at their heart are Frenchmen, and you can't trust them. And it's not until the 1820s, Napoleon dies, that finally Americans sort of back off this sense of always looking over their shoulder at Louisiana. I found a really interesting newspaper article that basically noted that there, with Napoleon's death, there was pretty elaborate funeral celebrations being planned in New Orleans, and it basically with sort of a rhetorical shrug is like, well, he's dead now, so if they want to honor Napoleon, not a big deal anymore. But 20 years earlier, that would have been a very big deal, and Americans treated it as such. If you actually look at the laws that were passed by the U.S. Congress to take possession of Louisiana, they're highly illiberal. They are not democratic, it basically sets up basically a council selected by the president to serve at his pleasure, to basically rule over the people of Louisiana. There's no sense of self-government. There's no sense of democracy, and it's going to be backed up by the army. The army is tiny at this time. The U.S. Army is tiny at this time, but basically the entire, at least a good 2/3 of the U.S. Army is put on station, put on alert to go to Louisiana and put down any rebellions that might show up. as well as basically the entire Mississippi militia. Is put on alert, to go into Louisiana and suppress any pro-Bonapartist rebellions that are expected. So yeah, this is not some triumph of democratic imperialism. This is heavy-handed, and Americans are willing to believe the worst about the people of Louisiana at the start, and it does sort of set the stage for how is American imperialism really going to work?
Well, I think what you just said also applies to West Florida, right? I mean, they're doing the very same thing in that case too, of like, ooh, Napoleon's coming closer again. Let's just eliminate that threat by taking over that.
Yeah. That's a bizarre story that most Americans don't know.
Right.
Everybody knows about the Louisiana Purchase.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a few people know about Andrew Jackson, questionable methods of obtaining Florida. But West Florida, nobody really thinks about. Yeah, so yeah, in 1810, they basically declare their independence. There's a coup. They declare their independence from Spain, it's a very interesting case of local politics. You do have quite a few West Floridans who do want to be annexed by the United States. Some would prefer to remain independent. I mean, we're talking about the little tails of what's now Mississippi and Alabama here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tiny little area, but it does control some important river mouths and trade but because this happens at the same time that the British are fighting Napoleon's armies in Spain, there's a sense that, okay, if they've declared their independence from Spain, okay, are they now part of the who are they? And are the British going to take this as a sense of, okay, well, we need to insert ourselves here, or is Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain, going to reassert control here? And well, okay, we've got another national security issue, and we need to send in the troops. Same thing happens. James Madison, basically ignores the Declaration of Independence and says, well, pursuant to the Louisiana Treaty, we've decided that this was also part of Louisiana, so we're going to send in the troops and just occupy it. And so I think it's West Florida is basically sort of quasi-independent for about 80 days, and then the U.S. just basically annexes it. Madison tries a similar thing with East Florida during the middle of the War of 1812, sort of setting up sort of a insurgency in East Florida. That goes far less well, and eventually he has to abandon the project of trying to annex East Florida. Although at the time, people, again, but in both cases, those Americans who were concerned about aggressive imperialism pointed to both of those kinds of say, wait, how is what you're doing any different from what Napoleon is doing in, let's say, Spain? And so there you go. You get okay. So one side is saying, well, we have to do this to prevent Napoleon from gaining control over here. And then another group of Americans is saying, no, I mean, how is this different? Are we going? We all agree Napoleon is bad. Are we willing to adopt those methods to gain our own empire, even if the ends are just?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, but in part, I think I want to go back to where you said that, like, Napoleon's military the concerns about Napoleon's military threat, right? That he has an army in Saint-Domingue, and then once he's finished up and tidied up that, he's going to send that army up to Louisiana and then take on and really kind of prevent the U.S. from expanding.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of took me back to, like, sort of that conversation, because this is happening during the Jefferson administration, obviously. And it took me back to sort of the Washington cabinet and this debate that they had of, like, who should we support, the French or the British? Who should we make treaties with? And sort of the notion that Hamilton has of, like, what's the French going to do? They don't have a navy.
Yeah.
They can't march their army over water. The big threat comes from Britain, and it was kind of interesting to see this concern in the public that the French are that much of a threat, considering it is so difficult for them to move their troops across
Yeah.
the ocean.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think part of that fear comes from the fact that, that army would not be coming from Europe. It would be coming from Haiti,
Mm.
Saint-Domingue. So we're talking only 100 miles off the American shores. The British Navy can't be everywhere. But the other fear that Americans have is Napoleon is a crafty character. They call him the wily Bonaparte. And so there's this sense of he doesn't need troops, at least not many in Louisiana. He has a way of convincing people to support him even without the threat of force. The indigenous population of Louisiana, is seen as a threat. What happens if Bonaparte gets them on his side, or the enslaved population of Bonaparte or of Louisiana? What happens if Napoleon gets them on his side? That's very much in the minds of Louisiana and Mississippi planters. And then not only that, but if Napoleon, he doesn't need many troops. If he can hold New Orleans, all he has to do is shut New Orleans down as a place of trade, just like we're seeing today with, say, the Strait of Hormuz. Right? You control a strategic point, and suddenly you have a whole lot of outsized political power. And so there's real fear. The real fear is that if Napoleon can shut down the trading post at New Orleans, what he's going to be able to do is convince the people, American Westerners, anybody west of the Appalachians has to send their goods by water down the Ohio to the Mississippi, and then out the Mississippi through New Orleans out into the world. And if Napoleon controls that and decides, okay, no American goods can go through here, he's going to have a lot of political pressure, and he's going to be able to say, well, if you were to join my empire, maybe we can make a deal. And Americans are terrified of that, because he's been, he's done the same thing in Europe, create these sister republics. He doesn't need all these. He doesn't need troops everywhere. He just needs troops in the right places to create this diplomatic pressure.
And kind of interrelated to that is that concept that you talk a lot about in the first part of the book, is that this natural boundary issue, right? And I thought that was interesting too, of kind of seeing how the perception of like a natural boundary for the United States started to shift in the course of this conversation, that the natural boundary is the Mississippi River. Oh no, it's not anymore, because hey, we want to go on further.
Yeah.
Or like Napoleon is showing us that natural boundaries don't matter that much.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. Yeah. So there's sort of a sense. No one's quite sure how boundaries are made. In really starting in the 17th century, 18th century, in the Enlightenment, what is rational when it comes to a national boundary? Before, there's this sense of, boundaries are wherever the king makes it. These are decided by military conflict. But then, the Enlightenment brings this idea of rationality to boundaries, and the idea, there's natural features on the in the world. You've got rivers, you've got deserts, you've got mountains. Those are natural boundaries, and nations ought to. It's good for nations to expand to their natural boundaries. The French showed the way on this. They sort of define their own natural boundaries. The Rhine River, the Pyrenees, and the Atlantic Ocean. So we got mountains, we got ocean, we got a river. In the U.S., they wonder the same thing. Okay, well, the Treaty of Paris said, the Mississippi River, but is that really our natural boundary? And and if it's not, where is it? Is it the Rocky Mountains? Is it the Pacific Ocean? Is it the Gulf of Darien, the Panama, the Panama area? Is it Mexico? Where is it? Is it into the Caribbean? Um, is it Canada? So where is our natural boundary? And there's a sense that if nations should expand to their natural boundaries, but if they expand beyond those natural boundaries, that's irrational, and that's what causes conflict. All right, so it's important to get your natural boundaries right and figure out what those are. Um, and there's also this sense, especially among the Jeffersonians, that this is just sort of natural, and nations, it's almost Newtonian. Nations will just naturally sort of expand like water into their natural boundaries and no farther. But Napoleon calls all that into question with his acquiring of Louisiana. And suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, maybe this isn't as natural as we thought, because if Napoleon's here, then he is impeding our natural progress. And what does that say about natural boundaries? And so maybe natural boundaries aren't as natural as we thought they were, and maybe there is some room for government agency and national agency in contesting these boundaries, making them real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's sort of the the fluidity of this period, right? I mean, it's also kind of that what you have when you said we don't know what these people in New Orleans are going to do when the United States takes over that region. In the same way that I kind of think of this, like, right, like you're picking a foreigner. Like, actually, I mean, you're picking a couple of foreigners. Columbus too is sort of that you don't have enough people in the U.S. You don't really have a U.S. identity quite yet. So Napoleon is sort of like a symbolic character that you can fit into something that helps you figure out your identity, I suppose.
Yeah, especially early on, many Americans see themselves as like the anti-Napoleon, the anti-Bonaparte.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to, there is not amongst all Americans, and I think that's important to note, but amongst many Americans, there is a sense that, look, there is going to be American expansion, there is going to be an American empire, but what is that empire going to look like? And a way to define what an American empire looks like is, well, not Napoleon, not Napoleon's empire, at least in the early days, right? Because we, in the while he's in power, he's the symbol of everything that's wrong with imperialism. He's bloodthirsty, he's ambitious, he doesn't stick to natural boundaries, he has this irrational sense of what of borders and boundaries. So we're not going to be like that. We're not going to be bloodthirsty. We're only going to expand to our natural boundary. We're not sure where those are, but we're going to expand to them, and not be like Napoleon. But then again, as we were saying earlier, after Napoleon's death, he's turned into this sort of liberal imperialist who broke monarchies and brought civil liberties to these poor peasants of Europe and that sort of thing. And so okay, that's the identity, that's the imperial identity we want to have as well.
And I kind of wondered about this one, since you're almost having to teach now. Sort of like as one other question, do you think that because the United States is such a consumer country, consumer culture, and it has always been that. I mean, we can look at the American Revolution, it's consumption of British good, right?
Yeah.
But do you think like it is because Napoleon is such a great tool that you can easily fit into this consumer culture that he is becoming and is so well known and popular in the United States, or is there something else there that might make him that interesting?
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. One of the things that really struck me as I was doing my research, much of my research was done in newspapers, And in the era of big data, I was able to do meta searches on newspapers all over the country and look for keywords, and it was really fascinating to see what came up. And a lot of what came up were especially later on, were Napoleon consumables. He had been commodified. I mean, every bizarre things, cake toppers, and which I totally want for my birthday at some point. A Napoleon cake topper.
Students hear
Cake
that.
topper. I mean, this was satire, but it was pointing out, pointing at something. There was a big long advertisement for the Napoleon pillow, and it guaranteed you a good night's sleep, just like Napoleon had on the night before Austerlitz. And but it's poking fun at this idea that you slap Napoleon's name on something, it will sell in the United States. But yeah, biographies, were extremely popular. Anecdote books were extremely popular. And the busts, Napoleon busts, were popular. Pictures, prints, Napoleon medals. One of the things, the anecdote that I start my book with is a story by a visitor to James Madison's Montpelier estate in the late 1820s, and he goes up there and he writes a letter afterwards. Excuse me. And the first half of the letter is just talking about all this Napoleon stuff he found in Madison's drawing room. And I was intrigued by that, so I actually sent a letter out to the good folks at Montpelier and said, "Hey, is there any other Napoleon stuff out there?" And they were wonderful. They compiled this whole list of everything they could, and it's just like pages upon pages upon pages of Napoleon stuff that Madison acquired during his lifetime, to include like life-size portraits and half a dozen books and at least 3 or 4 busts. It was fascinating that and here you have an
Sounds like a
American
man crush.
president. Yeah. He clearly was fascinated by Napoleon. He's only one of many Americans who are. I came across a statistic by one of the best literary historians of literacy in the United States, and he says, in the by 1830, Americans basically had 3 books. Virtually every American had access to 3 books: a Bible, a biography of Washington, and a biography of Napoleon. And I found that to be true in my own research. I went through library catalogs in New England, and like literally every single one had at least 3 or 4 biographies of Napoleon that people would check out and read, and yeah. So Napoleon was a commodity in the early republic.
Well, I think I need to buy a Napoleon biography because I think I don't have one.
Oh, there you go. There's lots to choose from.
Yeah, thanks. I have a Napoleon biography, but just not that Napoleon. And I think I'm not allowed to buy it as I want to move for us. But then, as sort of our final question for the day in our conversation here, I kind of thinking about you have military experience, you kind of studied Napoleon and the image of Napoleon. We have a couple of ways of how Napoleon is used, right? We have Napoleon of the West, which is Santa Anna in Mexico. We have the young Napoleon, which is McClellan. We have Napoleon of the Stump, as it's sometimes called, with Andrew Jackson. Who do you think who is the most fitting of people that have Napoleon associated as a nickname with them?
Oh my gosh. Oh, I'm going to equivocate here, and I'm going to tell. I would say all of them embody aspects of what Americans thought about Napoleon. Excuse me. I think Jackson certainly a huge admirer of Napoleon, and is not shy about telling people that, which worried actually quite a few Americans. Here we have a military chieftain who is a big admirer of Napoleon. I think he certainly embodied a lot of Napoleon's character, or at least what Americans thought about Napoleon's character, both good and bad. So I think that might be a place to start. I think McClellan thought of himself as a strategist in the terms of Napoleon. And could talk a lot about Napoleon. That doesn't necessarily translate well to the battlefield. Santa Anna, again, another self-described Napoleon of the West that Americans were willing to live with. It's kind of interesting. They mention him as the Napoleon of the West until he becomes a threat. And then when he starts losing military battles, then suddenly it's the so-called Napoleon of the West. It's always the so-called Napoleon of the West to sort of differentiate him from the real Napoleon who we admire. So yeah, it's hard to say. I think I spent the most time on Jackson, so I guess I'd go with that if pressed.
Well, there we go. Now you have something that the students can look at and talk about, and you can discuss.
Yeah.
But it is the time where you need to go and get ready for class at this point. So, Mark, I really appreciate you taking this little time this morning before you go into teaching to talk about your wonderful and really interesting book.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, thank you. And for those who are interested, it's Napoleon in America, Bonaparte and the Rhetoric of US Empire from the University of Virginia Press.